In the north of Middle-earth, nestled between two arms of the wild Grey Mountains, there is a valley of unimaginable danger. But on the map of Middle-earth, it appears to be relatively unremarkable, and it rarely receives a mention in the story, so it's very easy to either forget about the place or straight up not even know that it exists. So in this video, let's talk about the Withered Heath, the Valley of Dragon. Now on this channel, I pride myself on covering the little known topics, the places, persons or events that hardly get mentioned. Because let's face it, there's already plenty of biographies about Aragorn or Gandalf, and while I do enjoy bringing the lesser known things to the light, sometimes it's actually really difficult, because when it comes to some of those topics, there's so little information that it hardly seems worth doing a video. The Withered Heath is borderline one of those places, because, fun fact, it receives precisely one mention in the story, and that's in The Hobbit. Outside of maps, it does not appear anywhere else in Tolkien's main works. So, what do we know about the Withered Heath? Well, as you can see on the map, the Withered Heath is one of the most remote places in the Westlands of Middle-earth. It's a large valley in between the two diverging arms of the Grey Mountains. The Grey Mountains themselves being a place that were considered wild and unexplored, at least until the late Third Age. While the name is never explicitly explained, it seems to be self-describing. The valley was covered in a heath, a shrubland, that was withered, likely burned and dead on the account of the valley's inhabitants at that time, dragons. And yes, it's dragons that makes the Withered Heath interesting. By the end of the Third Age, Thorin Oakenshield refers to the Withered Heath as the breeding ground of the great dragons. But before I get to that, let's look at the history of the place, as we can get some idea of what was happening there based on what was going on in the Greater Grey Mountains and the other lands around the Withered Heath at the time. During the First Age, when the dragons were serving Morgoth in Angband, we know that the Grey Mountains were claimed by Durin's folk, but while they dwelt in the Misty Mountains and the Iron Hills far to the east, they hadn't actually colonized the Grey Mountains at this time. Northmen lived in the valleys between the Grey Mountains and Greenwood the Great at the time, but there's no mention of them actually dwelling in the mountains or in the valleys beyond. And given the Orcs were far to the east, or also serving Morgoth and Angband at this time, it's a fair assumption that during these years, the Withered Heath was empty. It probably wasn't withered either, it was just heath, I guess. Within the dawn of the Second Age, most of Morgoth's surviving servants fled east. However, their attempts to make a foothold in the lands south of the Grey Mountains were thwarted by an alliance of dwarves and Northmen. As a result, many of Morgoth's former servants, likely including dragons, remained hiding in the frozen lands of Forodwaith, out of the reach of their enemies, whilst they waited for evil to arise once again. This came with the War of the Elves and Sauron in the middle of the Second Age, and during these years, the alliance of the Dwarves and Northmen crumbled. The Dwarves became isolationist, and the Northmen were almost wiped out by Sauron's forces and men from the east that were loyal to him. Sauron also retaliated against the Dwarves for attacking him during that war by reinforcing those orcs in the north and commanding them to attack the Dwarves wherever they could. In the years that followed, Gundabad was taken from the Dwarves, and the Grey Mountains became infested with orcs. So in the late years of the Second Age, it seems that the Withered Heath would have received its first inhabitants in the form of orcs. Unfortunately, our information about the northern lands through the rest of the Second Age, and even much of the Third Age, is severely limited. But we know more following the year 1981 of the Third Age. This was the year that the Dwarves awoke a Balrog in Moria, and they were forced to flee. While the new king Thrain I went further east and established the Kingdom Under the Mountain at Erebor in 1999, at least some of his people were already gathering in the Grey Mountains, which were considered mineral rich. But in the year 2000, we also receive a mention of our first dragon in the Grey Mountains, Scatha, who had plundered a dwarven treasure hoard. He was killed by Fram, Lord of the Aethiod, men who lived in the northern Vales of Anduin. As the years went by, more dwarves would migrate to the Grey Mountains, and eventually Thorin I, son of Thrain, would officially move his kingdom to the Grey Mountains in 2210. This would suggest that the mountains, including the Withered Heath, were largely or even entirely under dwarven control. So, if it was first under Orcish control and then dwarven control, how then did the Withered Heath become infested with dragons? Well, we're also told that even as the dwarves were prospering in the Grey Mountains, the dragons in the northern wastes were themselves becoming powerful and multiplying. It seems that earlier dragons like Scatha were rogue opportunists and not a part of some organised effort to attack the dwarves, but this gradually changed in 2570 when the dragons attacked in force in a war that was called the War of the Dwarves and Dragons. The dwarves were gradually pushed back, and in 2589 the dragons struck a decisive blow in killing King Dane I outside the doors of his hall. Most of the dwarves then packed up and left under the leadership of King Thror. A few remained behind, but they seem to have been largely irrelevant and their fates are unknown. So having now driven the dwarves from the mountains and having plundered most of their halls, many of the dragons now relocated south, and the Withered Heath finally became their breeding ground. As for the rest of the mountains, they were once again inhabited by orcs. We don't know how well the two groups got along. At the very least, they seem to have tolerated each other because the orcs also began to grow strong. It's possible that during this time, Smaug the Golden was born in the Withered Heath. It was said to be the breeding ground of great dragons, of which Smaug was considered the last, and the timeline fits with Smaug's description during his life. And speaking of Smaug, he would show off how dragons now inhabiting a closer place like the Withered Heath could be devastating for the Free Peoples. In 2770, while he was still considered young, Smaug flew south and sacked Erebor, killing or driving off the dwarves, ruining the mannish city of Dale, and then making the Lonely Mountain his home. The fact that Smaug didn't receive help from his fellow dragons either suggests that Smaug was confident he could do it all on his own and would suffer no help, or that the dragons in the Withered Heath were currently content with their new home. Although the lands around the mountain would become known as the Desolation of Smaug for over 170 years, reminiscent of probably what the Withered Heath looked like, in the end, Smaug's abode in Erebor would not be permanent. During the quest for Erebor, Smaug was killed by Bard the Bowman from Lake Town and the mountain was freed. And while orcs from Gundabad and the Grey Mountains led by Bolg would attempt to claim the treasure, surprisingly, no dragons made an attempt. So what happened to the Withered Heath afterwards? Well, we're told that Smaug was the last of the great dragons, but we're never told how a great dragon was defined. Certainly, his fellow dragons weren't as bold as him. But Tolkien made it very clear that Smaug was not the last dragon, and that dragons would remain for millennia, even appearing close to our time, the in-universe reason as to why they're such a common part of mythology. This would all suggest that the Withered Heath remained a dangerous place for many years to come, a breeding ground for lesser dragons such as drakes and worms. Provided they did not attack southwards, any attempt to dislodge them by either dwarves or men would have been extremely costly and probably not worth it. If the dwarves intended on reclaiming the Grey Mountains though, then you'd think that they would have had to remove the dragons. But while we're told they did reclaim Khazad-dûm, no such story is told about the Grey Mountains and the Withered Heath. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, or at least found it interesting. If you want more about the Grey Mountains, dragons, and the Withered Heath, I can't offer you any more canon information, but I can tell you that those places feature in the Lord of the Rings Online, and some of the more relatively recent story updates involve dwarven conflicts with dragons, so you can always check those out. Cheers, farewell, and remember, if you ever read the Withered Heath as the Withered Half, don't worry, I did that for a long time too, because it also makes sense, I feel like.